Kia ora koutou. Welcome to lecture 2. I'm sorry my voice is a little bit hoarse today, but hopefully we'll manage to get through this without me losing my voice. So today's pre-recorded lecture is about the relationship between project management, project planning, and the request for proposal process, which is what sits behind the assignment and some of your learning experiences in this course. So the first thing I wanted to just give you an overview of where we're going. So a few more details about project management beyond the comments I made last week. A few comments about the place of planning in project management. And then really introducing to you this idea of the relationship between funders and people who plan and implement projects through the request for proposal process, and the place really of the project scope, particularly making sense of needs assessments and stakeholder management. So the first few comments I want to make are about project management itself. So a reminder that project management is about the planning, coordinating and controlling of projects. And in this course, we're particularly focusing on the planning aspects, although we're giving a little nod to the particular ideas that are important with project coordination and controlling, because they have to be threaded into the planning phase. So last week I talked to you about the fact that there are 5 phases of project management. So I just wanted to make a few more comments about those today to give a little context for some of the rest of this content of this lecture. So the first phase is the initiation phase. This is where the project team, primarily the project manager, are establishing what is to be accomplished broadly with this project. And generally at this stage, a project sponsor is identified. And so you can look up some of this language online if you want to read a little bit more detail about this. But the project sponsor really is the person or authority that the project manager would report to. So the project sponsor holds the ownership and the overall accountability for this project. And so it's really important right at the beginning in the initiation phase, there's a really clear place for this sponsorship of the project, who will be driving it. Because initially, projects will often have to seek funds, which is a little bit what I'm talking about today. And so someone, somewhere in some organization needs to be sponsoring this project. So that's part of what's established at the initiation phase. The second phase is the planning, and that's a big chunk of what we'll be doing around assignment 3 in this course. So in the planning phase, there's a lot of work put into establishing what will be delivered, what will be the main requirements that will be needed to be able to deliver this project, and what is the broad schedule of actions and who will be involved in this project. And the third phase of project management is executing the project, or sometimes this is called implementing the project. So this is making it happen. The next phase is about controlling, sometimes called monitoring. This is where consideration is paid to, we had our intended implementation, and now we've got the actual implementation based on what we've encountered, what risks we've encountered, what dilemmas we've encountered, what problems with resourcing, what problems with stakeholder relationships. And so the controlling and monitoring phase is key for managing all of these diversions and holes and boundaries that can happen around implementation. Finally, with successful implementation of the project and successful navigation through the controlling monitoring processes, a project will come to the end. And this is often called the closure phase of a project. It is just as significant as the other phases. It's where final evaluations might have to be undertaken or compiled. It's where final reports to the project sponsor will have to happen, reports to the funder if the funder is different from the organisational context where the project is happening. And it's where some of the responsibilities for the relationships that were developed within the project might need to be handed on to someone else. So it's a very important part of project implementation and project management. My next couple of comments are just a little bit of time focus for project management. Projects are always future-focused activity. They're always about where you're going, why you're going there, and how you're going to get there. So a project is always built on, this is what has happened before, this is where we are now, and this is where we're going. So project management is always about future focus. How are we getting to that place where we need to be to have implemented this project? Okay. So absolutely key to good project management are good planning. And I've just done a little bit of a compilation here of some of the key ideas from literature on why projects will often go awry, why they will go wrong. So primarily, they will go wrong because the project scope hasn't been developed sufficiently. So the project scope is really the initial piece of work that establishes some of the parameters of the project. So what the project is about, what it isn't about, what resources it is going to use, what it isn't going to use, what it is going to achieve, what it's not focused on bringing about change for. That kind of initial piece of work establishing the real parameters is absolutely crucial for the success of a project. And if that project scope is not clearly stated and understood, then the project will lose its way. The key to this are some of the estimates that are originally made in the project planning. So if the estimates are too optimistic, then things will fall over along the way. So these are the estimates of cost, what kind of resources are going to be required, what kind of people are you going to need to implement the project, how long will it take to implement different parts of the project, estimates of the benefits that will come about because of the implementation of this project. And if those estimates are too optimistic, then the project will stumble and fail somewhere along the way. The third area is about risk assessment. So because this is such a fundamental part of project success, I have got a separate lecture on risk assessment that we'll come back to in the future. So you have to anticipate risks right from the beginning, and you have to find a way to scope out what will we do when we encounter these particular risks that we think are likely to happen somewhere along the way, or that may happen and will have a particular impact. The fourth area is that a key part of all projects is being clear where you're going and how you will get there. And so the how you will get there is often called the strategy. Sometimes it's called the interventions, the project interventions. They're basically the proposed actions that you're going to take. So depending on the nature of your project, the strategy might be things like a social media campaign, a social marketing campaign, some training events, some education initiatives, the development of a resource. You know, these are all strategies that can be implemented to fulfill the expectations of your project. And if the wrong strategy is attached to achieve what you want, then the project will often stumble and fail. The next area of concern is the place of stakeholders, and I'll talk about this a little bit more near the end of this little mini lecture. So projects will fail when not sufficient attention is paid to who are the stakeholders and what are their interests and concerns. Another major area of consideration is the idea of change management. And again, later in the course, I've got one particular lecture about change management because this is significant for project success. In essence, when I talked about the introduction of a project last week, and again reinforcing that in the previous slide, all projects are focused on bringing about change where things were, where we are now, and where we hope to be. And a lot of attention has to be paid to what do you want to change? Who will need to be involved in that change? Are you wanting change in people's behaviors? Are you wanting change in circumstances? Are you wanting change in the way a service operates? There is real clarity required on what kind of change you want to bring about. And so projects will fall over if insufficient attention is paid to change. The final area is that all projects happen within particular organisational contexts. And if insufficient attention is paid to the way this project fits within the business plan of the organisation, then it will stumble somewhere along the way also. So there has to be some real clarity on where this project fits within the business plan of the organisation. It's got to make sense for why the organisation exists. So this next slide now is talking about being clear on what projects are and what is required of project managers and the importance of project planning. We need to also think about the fact that projects are bounded in time, and therefore the funding that is available and the time-focused nature of that funding is also bounded. So what this means is that somewhere along the line, someone who has some resources, some funding, has identified a need for this project and said, we want these funds and resources to be used for this kind of project. And we'll talk a little bit more shortly about the process of needs assessment that leads to that. So, and what do I mean by funders? I mean people like ministries like MB, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Development, Te Puni Kōkiri, the Ministry of Māori Development, or district health boards, or national NGOs, or public health units, or even iwi now. Now we're in a world of post-treaty settlements. These organisations have got some kind of funding that they want to throw at a particular problem that they have identified as really significant. And the way that they will commonly attach this funding to a potential time-focused project is through a process called a request for proposals. So sometimes request for project proposals, but normally request for proposals. So in essence, what they're saying is, we've got some money. We know there's a whole lot of people out there that could do this project. And so they develop this document usually, or sometimes a website, where they identify what they see as the problem and why they want someone to step up and respond to this problem. And they set some parameters of, we want someone who will come forward and do this kind of work for us. And so this is most commonly called a request for proposals. And so an organisation will see this request for proposals, see some fund attached to it, and they will step forward and go, we want to have a go at that. We think we can implement that, fits in with the purpose of our organisation. We think we can use that funding in meaningful ways to bring about that kind of change. And so they will submit a proposal to this organisation in response to the request for proposals. So the project proposal needs to be completed to the requirements of the funder. So they will always establish what their requirements are in the RFP. And it has to be completed to such an extent that it will convince the funders to fund your organisation to implement the project that you are proposing. So in this course, we're particularly focused on the project proposal, because this is a way that I've established you can get some really good understanding of what project planning is, and how this fits with common funding cycles within the health sector. So this is the most common RFP process that you will encounter. I've said processes, there's a number of processes, but this kind of overview that I've got here. So at the bottom, you can see the first part of an RFP process is the establishment of need. And the second part is the funder will go through some process of establishing that there is a need. They'll write their request for proposal document or brief, or establish a website that's got that material on it. And then they will invite submissions from organisations of project proposals. They will evaluate and review the project proposals that are submitted. And commonly at that stage, they will then request further details from some of the project proposers. So for example, a request for proposal might result in 200 project proposals coming into the funder. They will set up a review team. They'll go through all of those. They will narrow that down to, out of these 200, there's 6 that we're particularly interested in. And so we want to get some more information from those 6 providers about these to help us make our decision between which of these 6 we're going to provide, we're going to fund. Then once that process happens, and sometimes a key part of that process will mean doing project presentations to the funder. After that process happens, the funder will go, yep, that's the one project proposal we're particularly convinced about. And so they'll then begin a contracting process with the organisation to consolidate the parameters of the funding, transfer of funds. And usually there'll be some significant evaluation of the organisation by the funder to make sure that they're a safe organisation for them to fund, that their money is going to be put to good use. And then as a part of that project, a more detailed project plan will be written that is built upon the project proposal. So I just wanted to backtrack to the bottom of this common RFP process, the establishment of need, and make sure that you understand what this is about in the land of project planning and project proposals. In essence, someone, somewhere along the line, it might be the funder, or it might be another health authority, like a district health board, for example, or it could be another organisation, like a large NGO. They will have a particular community or population of interest, and they will be, this is in the world of population health, and they will be thinking about the needs of that population or community of interest. They'll think about what are the particular needs that that population has, and they will hold up against those actual needs, which of those needs or how many of those needs or for which subpopulations are those needs actually being met. And between the actual need and the needs that are actually being, the needs that are being met by existing services processes, there'll be a gap. And usually this gap is strongly related to health inequalities. Not always, but usually. And so the funder is particularly interested in developing a request for proposals to get a project to address the gap in these needs. So the needs, this assessment of needs, which I'll talk in a little bit more detail shortly, can be summarized within the request for proposal documents. They can say we've established these needs that we want someone to step in and respond to. Or they may be implicit, they may be drawing on information that is widely held elsewhere. Or sometimes an RFP can actually be stating, we want someone to do a needs assessment. So mostly these kinds of needs are focusing on reduction of mortality statistics, morbidity statistics. So there'll be some kind of known quantity or information about this, that they are initiating this RFP to call on someone to establish a population health program of some sort. It may focus on particular services. We know this service exists and we want this service to do what it does better. We know that this service exists and it's meeting these user needs, but not these user needs. It may focus on reorganizing existing services. So I've got an example for you to have a look at about the air ambulance helicopter service. It may be looking at connecting people with existing services, or it may be establishing new services. And I've got another example for you to have a look at the expression of interest that's related to primary healthcare that was a part of the 2008 change of government. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. So need has been established and this informs what is written within the RFP. So I just wanted to make a few more comments about the request for proposal itself. In essence, a request for proposal is an invitation to potential suppliers of a product. And so increasingly, health funders are using the language of procurement. So we're procuring services from the suppliers of a product or providers of a service to submit a proposal. But there is some different language that's used that you will encounter out there in the real world. Sometimes funders will talk about an ROI, or in recent times, this is more commonly languaged as an EOI. So this is an expression of interest. And so the example I've given you to have a look at in your resources is when the National Party came back into power in 2008, they wanted to implement their better, sooner, more convenient primary healthcare policy. And as a part of that, they wanted to establish some integrated family health centres in the country. So they developed this expression of interest document that they sent out there into the health sector. And they wanted existing primary healthcare providers to change what they were doing, to organise themselves differently to be able to implement this better, sooner, more convenient primary healthcare policy. Sometimes there are other processes that are involved that will sit before an RFP. So two examples of these are a request for quotes or a request for information. So usually these kinds of processes are precursors to an RFP. So they are set up to gather some information about who is out there and what are they doing and who might step into an RFP space. And then the funder will use information from that first RFQ, RFI cycle to provide more detailed information into the RFP that they then issue following up that. So there is some really good information online where you can tease apart the differences between an expression of interest, a request for a quote, a request for information, and a request for a proposal. So I've got a little hyperlink here that I encourage you to go and have a look at. It's not very long to look at, so I won't take you long. And to give you a little bit of a sense about some of the variety of these procurement processes that exist, I have got a link here to the government procurement website. And in particular, I encourage you to go and you'll see it's got RFX on that website so that the X can be replaced with other variables like I or Q or P. So you'll see on that website, there's a range of different templates. Don't get too caught up in the detail, but I encourage you to go and have a look at under the government model RFX template section on that page, have a look at the RFP template and a look at some of the key expectations under some of the headings. Finally, just signaling that this kind of process of responding to an RFP by submitting a project proposal is quite complex, and some organisations believe they don't have the expertise to do this, or they don't have enough human resources to do it, because you are not guaranteed of funding that will come to the organisation as a result of this process. So some organisations will pay for a project management consultant to actually respond to an RFP on their behalf. Costs money, there's real trade-offs in doing this. But nevertheless, there are project management consultants out there who will do this work for organisations. And so just reinforcing at this stage that the project proposal that is submitted in response to an RFP is the first iteration of a project plan. And once that project proposal is reviewed by a funder and contracting starts to happen, then a further iteration of the project plan is developed. At the time of submitting a project proposal, there is no contract. However, there are some real ethical concerns for project proposers that they are careful that they are not over-promising. So you need to be really clear as a project proposer, you are not saying you can do something that your organisation would not be able to do. So real care is required around that aspect. So returning to this process, talked about establishment of need, a little bit more detail about what an RFP is, and then this idea about further details being requested. So there are a few different reasons why a funder will request further details. Commonly, it can be named as a process right at the outset within the RFP itself. So for example, the Better Sooner More Convenient Primary Healthcare process, that was an expression of interest, which is clearly signaling we're going to gather information now and then we're going to gather more information later. But it can also happen because the funder is not quite clear about which of these possible proposals really might be best, and so they want to get more information from the proposer. Or it might mean that the proposals they receive are not quite what they hoped for. So for example, I was a part of a team that submitted project proposal for a huge funding round for the National Science Fund. And across all of New Zealand, they did not get any projects that were sufficiently addressing Māori health inequities around this particular topic. And so they didn't accept any of the proposals that were submitted, and they established another round of RFPs that had some slightly more nuanced expectations in them. The most common process, however, is that funders will have some general ballpark possible organisations they're interested in, possible projects they're interested in, which could be from 6 to 20, and they will ask those organisations to come and meet with them and usually to do a presentation. So this is one of the things, because it happens commonly, that I have threaded into this course. So as a project team, you will have to start to develop your project proposal, and then you will come and present your project proposal in a simulated meeting to funders. and then you'll get some feedback on that, and then you'll go away and write up your final written proposal. So, so just going back to our overview of the process, this is the common process. And then by the time it gets to the stage that a funder has said, we want to fund your project, then a whole contracting process then starts to play out. And as a part of that, an organisation will be expected to produce a much more detailed project plan in light of the conversations with the funder. Okay, so that's an overview of what project management is and the phases, what common processes of RFPs are, some of the things to pay attention to. So what I want to spend just a few more slides talking about is a little bit more about this idea of needs and a little bit more about this idea of stakeholders and how important they are for project planning, and particularly for the development of project proposals. So on this slide here, I've just got some particular comments about whose needs are being addressed and for what purpose are these needs being addressed. So in the population health world, where project proposals are being developed, the most common process is that there is a target population that has been identified by the funder, you know, the ministry, the DHB, large NGO, iwi provider, that they've identified there's this particular target population that we are concerned about their health needs. And so the needs assessment can sometimes be looking at what is currently happening to meet those needs and being really clear how that's working or not working, who's going to those services, not going to those services. But it can also be about establishing a new activity. So it might be thinking about existing activity and that target group, and how are our current services working, or it can be establishing a new activity to meet the needs of that current target group. A needs assessment can also be carried out because there might already have been previous needs assessments carried out of these populations. But we know that demographics have changed. So common situations, for example, in Auckland, we've got larger new immigrant populations in this set of communities than we had before, or we've got larger refugee communities here than we've ever had before, or we've got more Pacific people living in these communities than we've ever had before. So if the target population looks like it's changed, the demographics have changed, then a large health provider will initiate a needs assessment to think about, so what needs might this population have that are different from before? The other reason that needs assessments get carried out is when there's been a shift in national policy, or could be regional policy, district health board policy. And so because there's been a shift in policy, they think, we actually are saying we're doing more of this. We want to do more of this now. Ministry has said we want to do more of this. So let's carry out a needs assessment to see how much of that is already happening, because that was never on our radar before. So what all of this means is that a clear purpose is either defined or redefined through this needs assessment process. And that defined or redefined purpose will help to establish the objectives for a program or a project, and help to develop some logic on which kinds of strategies do we need to adopt, given that we now know that these are the needs of these populations that we're looking at. So that's a little bit more context on the place of needs. So overall, a needs assessment takes a snapshot of where we are, what have we got in place currently, and where do we need to go. And the needs assessment does not focus on the means for achieving this, but the needs assessment focuses on the endpoints. Where do we need to be? And this is actually quite important because there are other parts of the project planning phase, like stakeholder analysis, identification of local context, things like that, that actually play more into establishing the strategy, the ways to achieve things. But actually a good needs assessment on the whole is focused on where do we need to be if we're going into the future to meet these population health needs. So a needs assessment provides a foundation for future decision making. That's the groundwork for identifying your goals, identifying your action areas, and it starts to take on board the views of stakeholders and consider the local context. The nature of a good needs assessment is that it's integrative. So what I mean by this is a good needs assessment thinks about on the ground local voice, like how do communities identify their own needs, as well as the professional experts' views when they're from the outside looking in. This is how they see the needs. So a good needs assessment integrates these together. A good needs assessment analyzes the nature of the needs and the urgency of needs. So that shapes what's in the RFP. We're prioritizing these kinds of things in our RFP, not those kinds of things, because the needs assessment has helped us make these decisions. And a good needs assessment is reflexive. So it has these feedback loops. So the most common reflexive process in a good needs assessment is there's some kind of draft document written, and there is some kind of consultation hui where other voices are allowed to feed into that. We think we've identified these needs. Is that what you see as the needs? And there's a process that feeds into that. A couple of, just to anchor you in these needs assessment processes. At the bottom left of the screen here, I've got a couple of links that I've suggested in your other preparation for our time together, is you have a look at this DHB example of a needs assessment. It's common for district health board needs assessments to look like this. So they're quite long documents. So just have a look at some of the key headings in that document, read some of the summaries, and to get an idea of how these needs assessments are framed. And there's another link here to a community perspective on needs assessment. You'll see it's got a different nature to it. And so, yeah, so depending on who is initiating the needs assessment, depends a little bit on the scope, breadth, depth, and detail of it. A note here on the top left that sometimes there are different types of needs and they don't always overlap clearly. And this is why consultation hui are really important when people are doing needs assessment. So people from the outside looking in, like public health physicians, people who are working as academics or researchers, experts, they will be often looking at comparative need between different populations or subpopulations. People who are living in communities, in target populations, they will have their own sense of expected, wanted, desired, or felt needs. And that these different understandings of needs don't always intersect, but finding ways for them to intersect is a really important part for good development of project proposals. And my final comment about needs assessment is that there are some really good frameworks for carrying out needs assessments. And this is one of the most common ones that's utilised, the PESTLE framework, where these different kinds of factors, political, economic, sociocultural, are considered as a part of a needs assessment. So there's a really good elaboration of this PESTLE needs assessment framework at this link. So I encourage you to have a look at that. My next set of comments are about stakeholders and project planning. So this is the final piece of this little mini lecture. Stakeholders are the people who have some kind of stake in whatever this potential project is about. So they've got some share in it, some interest in it, some potential involvement in it, or some current actual involvement in it. So in general, the people who have got a vested interest in the outcome of the project. They've got an interest in how the project is implemented. So a common example of this is if a project is focused on responding to some of the needs of Pacific communities, then Pacific people have got a real interest in how the project is implemented to meet Pacific needs. Stakeholders are people who can affect a project in some way. So sometimes these are people who can affect a project positively, and sometimes people who can affect a project negatively. So when you're thinking about stakeholders as a part of a project proposal process, like your assessment, you need to think really widely. Who are the people who can benefit from this kind of project? Who are the people that might lose from it? You know, if this project's implemented, it will actually have a negative impact on these people in some way. Who are the people who might be able to stop it? They could interfere with it. Who are the people who might be able to aid the project? So make sure you think widely about your stakeholders. The list of some possible stakeholders. So who's going to be a part of your project team? In a large organization, who are the different people that are a part of the organization who could be a part of it? If your project involves some kind of test, or tool or measure, then is there someone who regulates or has legal ownership of that test or measure or tool that you'll have to get authority from? Who are the people who are existing service providers? So the organizations who already do something about this. Some of these might see your new service as competition for what they're doing. So you need to know who's already out there doing things. If you're going to do something similar to what they're doing, you might want to consult with them to talk about how you want to complement what they're doing rather than be in competition with what they're doing. Who are the people that are already using services or who are not using services because of a whole variety of reasons, access, cultural safety? Who are the people that could be using services? Who are the political players, those who could influence this kind of project? And finally, think about what you want to change as a part of your project and who will benefit from that change and who will lose out from that change. So project plans, when they're written in detail, will have a stakeholder management strategy. Depending on the RFP, there might be a requirement at the RFP stage that the project planners will write a stakeholder management strategy. So this is just a brief overview here of what's in a stakeholder management strategy. Excuse me, a little cough. Just naming that these are really common processes, that a stakeholder management strategy will have these things. In your assignment work in this course, you don't have to develop a stakeholder management strategy. However, you do need to do the precursor to this by identifying who the stakeholders are that can be part of your project proposal. The final set of comments I want to make are that stakeholders exist within local contexts of all projects. So all projects happen within a particular local context. So that might be a neighborhood, a set of communities, a suburb, an area, could be a region like the Auckland region, or the Waitemata region, could be across the city. Regardless of what that kind of local area is, that local area has got some considerations that you need to take into account when you're developing a project proposal. So I've factored in the importance of this into your assignment expectations to start to expand your understanding of the importance of local context. So stakeholders exist in a place, and the place where they exist needs to be, you need to pay attention to that. So the local context has its own history, and the people who are in that place have their experience of this problem, and they may even have experience of other people saying we have a solution to this problem. And the people in that local context might not have a positive experience of previous solutions to this problem. So you have to pay attention to the local context. Local contexts have got their own people. So within Aotearoa New Zealand, we need to pay attention to who are mana whenua within a particular region, who are the iwi or the hapu that have authority in this region, that if you're going to be doing something that has impacts on Māori, you need to be consulting with that group, those mana whenua groups. So you need to know who they are. And is there an existing group that represents the needs of those mana whenua, and how might your project team engage with that group so that you are not stepping on toes and you are enabling the success of your project and not perpetuating harm to those groups like to Māori. Local contexts have their own demographics, and projects need to pay attention to those demographics. Local contexts have their own social institutions. Social institutions, I mean the institutions that exist that are a part of social interactions, like cultural institutions, for example, cultural centres, cultural resource centres, marae, churches. For our Pacific communities, COVID has proved to us time and time again that churches are really important when we're paying attention to population health. Social institutions could be particular transport infrastructure, particular sporting, the presence of a sporting code or a sports stadium. So we have to pay attention to these local contexts. And finally, there are economic institutions that drive the life of a local context. So there are particular big employers or big manufacturers that are located somewhere. They might be the main employer of lots of the people that you're wanting to reach in your population health initiative. So you need to think about some of those economic institutions as well. For example, in COVID, it's become really clear over the last 6 months that the people who are living and working around the airport, we need to pay attention to them. Who are they? Where do they live? How far do they travel to get to their jobs? These kinds of economic institutions are closely tied to social institutions. So these are the important connections between stakeholders and local context. Okay, so overall, I've explored the relationship between project management and project planning. I've overviewed the process of the request for proposals. I've talked about how the project proposal is an early form of the project plan, and I've identified the importance and complexity of needs assessment and stakeholder analysis. In the next session when we meet, I'll unpack these aspects a bit further in relation to the course processes and the assessments in the course. So I look forward to talking to you about that then. In the meantime, follow up and have a look at some of the key resources I've identified for you that relate to some of these key examples I've talked about in this lecture. Kia ora.